Hello, and thank you for joining today's session, an introduction to the EMS Compact. You might also have heard this referred to as the United States Emergency Medical Services Compact. Hey, my name's Donnie. I'm the Executive Director of the EMS Compact. So first, I want to go over a little bit of history of compacts, set a historical foundation for this legal mechanism that we use today. If we go back through history to the original 13 colonies, the Mayflower and Jamestown and that time of American history, well, you had 13 original colonies, and each of these colonies were actually a type of a sovereign territory. They each had their own government systems and their beliefs and their approach to government. But yet they were both neighbors and still under the sovereign rule of the King of England. So these colonies had to figure out a way to coexist with their neighbors. And they actually had border disputes. They had disputes about water and rights and a number of things. So to solve this problem of having a independent type of a colony, yet they have to work with their neighbor, there was this concept of a compact that came out. And a compact was a legal agreement. Now, in the days of the colonies, they actually went before the king and they had this council, and it was through this mechanism that these individual colonies were able to solve their problems. As these colonies progressed and the United States was formed, this same concept of preserving a state's individual rights while providing a mechanism for them to actually coordinate with other states came into the U.S. Constitution. And when it did, it came in as a mechanism of an agreement that's both a state law and a contract. So the compact clause of the U.S. Constitution is Article 1, Section 10, Clause number 3. And this is what provides the legal foundation for states to be able to maintain their unique sovereign authority as granted by the Constitution, yet work together outside of the federal government to actually create and solve problems of mutual interest and mutual concern. If we look today, compacts are what I would call the secret sauce that actually allows the United States to function in the way that you and I enjoy every day. There are over 450 interstate compacts currently active in the United States. These cover everything from water rights and rivers through oil and gas and education and insurance and driver's licenses and airports and metro authorities. In fact, you've probably heard about a number of these. If you've ever taken the metro system in New York or New Jersey along the East Coast, well, that's made possible through a compact. The Washington Metro Airport Authority and our nation's capital that covers both Reagan and DC, that's a compact that allows that to happen. If you've ever utilized an insurance policy or if you've ever driven in another state that you weren't licensed in, those are all forms of compacts. So compacts are where individual states get together and they solve problems, and they do this by passing a law. And that's very important. So a state passes an actual piece of legislation. It goes through the complete legislative process, both houses to the governor for signature. So that becomes a state law. But that state law also takes the form of a contractual agreement. And this contractual agreement, just like any contract that you've ever signed in your life, the states consider the terms, they come to an agreement, and every party to this contractual agreement has to agree to the same language. That's exactly how compacts work. So let's talk about how compacts are a part of state law. But not only just part of state law, compacts are a very special part of state law. In almost all compacts have what is referred to as a supremacy clause. And this clause says that this new state law that states are entering into takes precedent or has authority or has a higher position than any other law of the state on the same topic. And this is important for a number of reasons. Because I said state compacts are state law and contractual agreements, well, you can't have a single state change the terms of the contract. that would nullify the compact. So compacts have the supremacy clause that's put into them. Furthermore, this has made it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court has ruled multiple times that because it's state law and it's compact law, states can't unilaterally change it, and it takes precedent. Let me bring this back to EMS really quick. We have the EMS Compact, which we're going to go through here in a few minutes. But the EMS Compact says that one state license is recognized through a privilege to practice in the other member states. I'm going to go through that. But many states, probably every state, also has another law on the books that says an EMS agency or maybe an ambulance shall be staffed by someone who is licensed by the state. Well, does that create a conflict? Because now you have one state law that says under the compact, we will recognize a license from another state, but then you have this agency law or this ambulance law that says you have to be licensed in the state. Well, the compact essentially says, hey, once we pass this compact law, we recognize under the provisions of the compact, a state issued license in another state is valid in this state. That law will have supremacy over the definition of what it means to be a licensed personnel. And therefore, under the compact, once a state passes the law, you can indeed have a compact privilege and work in an ambulance. That's one example of where there could be some types of conflicts between existing law and new law, or existing law and compact law, and how the compact law would supersede and rectify those issues. Now, it's important to note the compact law went through the same legislative process, and it was an eyes open approach through your entire legislative body when they enter a compact. So I already mentioned there are about 450 compacts, but there are 17 compacts that are what we call occupational, professional, or medical licensing compacts. Today, we're going to really focus on the EMS compact, but just for your awareness, there are psychology compacts and counseling compacts. You've probably already heard of the nurse licensure compact. You may have heard about the physician compact, but there's dental compacts, social work, physical therapy, occupational therapy, physician assistant. There are a lot of compacts that are out there. And so from an EMS perspective, this is very important. Not only was the EMS compact one of the original compacts, but we also need to make sure that EMS providers have the same professional recognition and license mobility as our colleagues in all of these other professions. That's very important for us as an EMS profession to continue to advance as a medical profession. So as we talk about these medical licensing compacts, I just want to show, and this is current as of 2024, early 2025. But for instance, the nurse licensure compact up on the top right of the slide, you can see has a large number of states that are participating. We also have the physician compact, a large number of states, physical therapy and occupational therapy. Since 2016, over 325 individual pieces of legislation have been passed across the United States related to compacts. This is not a new type of a solution. As I've already mentioned, compacts go to the very founding of our profession. And that is important for us to remember. Also, across the United States, every single state participates in at least one licensure compact. And well, as you can see from the map, many states participate in many of these licensure compacts. Interstate compacts are now the absolute gold standard for occupational or professional or medical licensing. And this is for a number of reasons. Now, if you go back, I've been doing EMS over 30 years, and some of you may have been doing it for that longer, even longer. We had a lot of what we would call gentlemen agreements. And let me give you an example. I was a paramedic on the border of Virginia and West Virginia, and I frequently had to transport patients into West Virginia. That was the right thing for the patient. It was the right thing for the profession. However, I was never licensed as a paramedic in West Virginia. And West Virginia law as with laws in your states, are usually very clear that for you to actually practice medicine or practice as a paramedic, you have to be licensed in that state. And yes, we can say it's an artificial state line, but those artificial state lines are very important for state sovereignty. So compacts solve that and many, many issues. One is, as we've established, compacts are part of state law, and it's backed by the actual Constitution of the United States. Very powerful legislation. It establishes through contract terms mutual recognition, and this allows for a trusted, validated, verified process and practice to recognize a license from one state to another. It's no longer ad hoc or a so-called gentleman's agreement. It provides this professional mobility for both clinicians, military families that we're going to talk about, and actually for the modern workforce demands. The modern workforce expects mobility. I've moved multiple times in multiple states, and you may have done the same. That's very important to have this professional mobility so you don't have to start over from scratch. It also preserves accountability. This is very important. The public demands and expects accountability. Compacts build this into the model. And then finally, well, it is a permanent solution and it is enforceable. Unlike executive orders or temporary waivers or these so-called gentleman agreements between states, compacts, because they are part of the law, they are enforceable. They can be adjudicated through court. It preserves both the rights of the individual EMT, the individual paramedic, but also the rights of our patients and the rights of those that we treat and the public. So let's actually transition to talk about the EMS Compact. And let's talk about what it is and what does it mean for you. So if we look back at what I would call the traditional system, EMS as a profession is still a relatively young profession. We essentially came around in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and then we had a decade of really trying to figure out what it meant to be an EMT. Paramedic, as you may remember, the first national standard curriculum was created in 1977. So as a profession, we're still relatively young. But during that time, our 50 individual states, each was implementing EMS. Now, in another discussion, we can talk about really the history of fragmentation and what happened in detail, but here's a really quick process. So 1970s, we had everyone together, really on the same page, working together to create a unified system. There was a master plan for having 300 regional EMS systems. There was a federal government lead for EMS. There was federal standards being put out. There was federal funding. Billions of dollars towards creating a unified system for EMS. Well, 1980 came and the U.S. entered into a recession. There was global politics that came up and the political culture really changed, and the EMS Act actually was revoked and the funding essentially went away. It got shifted, and what was this unified system approach to EMS rapidly just disintegrated in front of our eyes. However, states and local communities really valued EMS. It was truly saving lives and making a difference. So a lot of local heroes came together and they preserved and continuing to develop EMS at the very local level. And while that was great for the individual local level systems, and it created a lot of ownership at the local level, it also meant that our systems approach no longer existed. And so not only did we have 50 individual states do it 50 different ways, within those states, you had local regions, local agencies that often did things different. And that's where the phrase, well, if you've seen one EMS system, you've seen one EMS system came about. But I would say that today, that phrase no longer holds true. We've largely came back to a unified standard. And we do have different requirements for state licensure. But we have, came together and for the most part agreed what an EMT is, what a paramedic is, how you get trained. We have some micro level variances, but we have a lot of similarities. But state licensure still remains one of those parts of the EMS system that, hey, if you want to work in multiple states, you have to have multiple licenses. I currently have 3 individual state licenses. At one point, I had 6, and I talked to someone recently and they had 25. And I suspect that many of you watching this Con-Ed session have had multiple state licenses already in your career. Well, the other thing with having a fragmented 50 different state approach is there's limited public accountability. Unfortunately, there are a few bad players that are in every profession. Most EMS providers are amazing, but we do have some who get in trouble and we do have some bad actors. And well, some of these bad actors have realized that if they get their license suspended or revoked in one state, because states are in silos, they can go to another state and simply not report that violation. And that's a problem for professional trust and accountability for everyone. So we need a solution for this. The other thing that we've realized and that we understand is that EMS by definition is mobile. I already told you about practicing as a paramedic in Virginia and transporting patients into West Virginia. While state lines are important, when it comes to patient care, we always do what's right for the patient. The next thing is we know that EMS has a really high attrition rate, meaning the number of people who enter the profession leave, unfortunately, pretty quick. Every year, it's estimated that between 20 and 36% of EMS clinicians actually leave our profession. And so we have a tough time replacing people faster than they leave. This is twice the rate for nurses, 3 times for physical therapists, and 5 times the attrition rate for physicians. We also know that the average age of EMS clinicians right now in the United States is somewhere between 34 and 35 years old. Well, that's very low compared to our colleagues in other medical professions. Well, this generation is what some would refer to as the Gen Mobile generation. Basically, we know that 35 and under, and many of you are probably in that category, this generation prefers flexible work locations. They want to be able to see the world and travel. And they will choose that even over higher salaries. So mobility is very, very important. I can tell you, I've worked in over 20 locations in EMS at all different ranks, from an EMT and paramedic through flight paramedic through EMS chief and state director. Life's been mobile for me, and it's extremely rewarding. So we recognize that this is an important aspect of our profession. So in 2011, 2012, a bunch of state leaders came together. One is through the National Association of State EMS Officials, NASIMSO, and that's usually the governor offices of EMS, the state EMS directors, and their staff. So they came together with the Department of Homeland Security and all of these agencies that are listed on the slide to actually say, we need to solve this issue of the realities of EMS. It's mobile. We have a kind of a fragmented licensure approach, and we need to do something that helps increase mobility. And it was through this group, led through, again, the Department of Homeland Security and NASIMSO, that came together and said, why don't we create a compact for EMS? And so that was the very origins of the EMS Compact. So this group of really visionary individuals came together and they identified what would be important for an EMS Compact. And then after that, they started creating model legislation, and that was in 2013. Model legislation is that same piece of law that has to be passed in every state. Again, it's not enough for states to say, I want to be part of the compact. They have to pass the law, and that law has to be the exact same language in every state. So that was 2013. 2014 was really a year spent towards educating the workforce, educating EMS clinicians and states. And then in 2015, the first piece of legislation was passed, and that was Colorado, followed by Texas. And then by 2017, 10 states had passed the legislation. Now, on our image, on our logo that you can see there, or the symbol for the EMS Compact, you'll see that there are 10 EMS stars of life around the bottom. Well, that signifies the first 10 states that passed the legislation. And the law, the contract, said that once 10 states pass this legislation, then the compact will actually be formed. So we had to have at least 10. So those are the 10 states there. In 2020, the compact was officially activated, meaning that we had the work in place for it to be used. It took about 3 years to create this. And then as we transition in through 2024, 2025, as of recording this, we have 25 states. Now, I do want to call one other highlight on this slide, and that is some of the symbolism in this symbol of the EMS Compact. You have the red outline, and that red outline with hashtags through it represents the red tape of bureaucracy. And when this symbol was adopted, we had 24 states that was part of the EMS Compact. So you have 24 hash marks in that. And that represents the symbolism of 24 states, their legislators, their governors coming together to unify EMS and to reduce the red tape of bureaucracy. You obviously recognize the star of life in the middle, and then a more focused star in the center of that. That more focused star means that through this unified legislation, we now have a unified focus. You also see the arrow moving to the right, and that is we have not only a unified focus, but we are advancing the profession forward. So there's some of the symbolism of even the symbol for the EMS Compact. Now, let's understand some of the components of the EMS Compact. You've probably heard about the compact, but maybe you've heard about some of these other elements as well and kind of wondered, well, how do they all fit together, or what's different, or it's the same? So the first I want you to understand is replica. Replica is the recognition of EMS Personnel Licensure Interstate Compact. In short, this is the law. This is the title of the law that every state passes. As you know, and you've probably heard, any great law requires an acronym, and that acronym should be something that can be said and have some meaning. Well, for EMS, for the EMS Compact, it's replica. You can almost see it's like replicating one state license in a number of states. So that's the origins of replica. And so replica is simply the law. Now, the law, this model legislation, has 15 components. And you can see the components on the screen. As with any law, it starts out with a purpose section and definitions. But then it goes into home state requirements and the privilege to practice. It also includes a relationship clause to EMAC. EMAC is the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, another compact. So the EMS Compact does not compete with EMAC. In fact, they are engineered and designed to actually work together for slightly different purposes. The law also goes through and establishes the Interstate Commission for EMS Personnel Practice. It talks about the coordinated database, rulemaking, oversight, and even severability. Just because a state enters into a contractual agreement, it doesn't mean that they're bound for all of eternity. A state maintains their sovereign authority, even if they choose to be part of the compact. And if at any point in the future, if the state says, hey, this is no longer good for us, well, there's a way for them to get out of it. That's extremely rare in any contractual agreement between states. As I've noted, there's like 450 compacts right now. So for states to actually get out of a compact, it's rare. But there's a mechanism in place. As with any good contract agreement, all of this is actually put up front, very transparent. I already mentioned that, well, compacts are part of state law, and the EMS Compact is indeed part of state law. On the screen, you see a few of these examples from different states. And you can see that the model law, the model legislation, has been adopted as state law and it becomes part of the EMS Act of that very state. So for instance, if I'm in Pennsylvania which is a part of the EMS Compact, well, the compact law becomes part of the EMS Act and the EMS law of that state. Same thing with Colorado or Utah or South Dakota. All the states that have adopted the law, this is law on par with every other EMS law in your state. So the next part of this law section, which is very, very important, and it goes over the purpose statement. And I just want to spend a little bit of time walking through, this is exact verbatim language of what is in the state law defining the purpose of the compact. So you can see the compact is intended to facilitate the day-to-day movement of EMS personnel across state boundaries. So that first phrase there, day-to-day, is very important. And that's actually a legal phrase, and it means day to day, today, today, today. It's an ongoing perpetual day to day. Some compacts define time limits. For instance, the driver's license compact gives a time limit. If I move from one state to another state, I have a time limit where that compact is recognized, and then I have to get a license by that state I moved to. The EMS Compact does not include a time limit. Instead, it's to facilitate day-to-day movement, which means any day to any day and every day to every day. So it's the day-to-day movement of EMS personnel. Now, the other thing is it's across state boundaries, and the performance of their EMS duties, here's the key, as assigned by an appropriate authority. But we're going to go into this a little bit more. But this is really important. An appropriate authority is best understood as the state EMS office or a state EMS agency. That's the easiest way to understand an appropriate authority. The commission has defined this in the administrative rule. So it's for EMS personnel to have mobility when they are working for an EMS agency. And then, well, the next part of this is it authorizes the state EMS offices to provide an immediate legal recognition. That phrase immediate is very important. Different compacts can define how those compacts work. Some compacts require for you to actually request or apply for a new license or a compact license or a compact privilege. The EMS Compact actually does not have an application. I get a lot of questions to my office saying, well, how do I apply for a compact privilege? Or how do I apply for a compact license? Well, the answer is you don't. Because you have a valid license issued by a compact state, that is immediately recognized in another state. And again, we recognized in the early days that EMS is both mobile and EMS, in their course of their action, it's important for them not to have delays in requesting or doing paperwork. So the EMS Compact provides this immediate legal recognition to EMS personnel licensed in any member state. That is very important for understanding how the compact works. So essentially, under the EMS Compact, one state license is valid as of today in 2025 in 25 states with zero paperwork. There's no fee. You don't pay anything for this privilege. You don't fill out an application for this. So you can practice instantly in compact states. No notice, no forms, no delay. And your compact privilege is actually always active, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So what does this mean for any of the compact states, or maybe for employers? Well, what this means in very direct terms is that you now have access to over 400,000 qualified EMS clinicians that your state legislators have said, we recognize the process, we've established standards, and they have a privilege to practice in our state. Now, they're accountable to our state laws, And there's a mechanism for doing that, and there's some requirements for them to be able to work. But that's very important for both you as an individual clinician or as an employer. Now, I do want to note that, yeah, while there's no license required outside of your home state license, there's no compact license and there's no compact paperwork, you still have to be operational. And operational involves a number of practical things. You have to be able to fill out EMS patient care reports. You have to be able to utilize computers. You have to have protocols. So we're going to talk through all that. But from a license perspective, you don't apply for a new license. Now, what this does is this provides some really new opportunities for a very modern EMS workforce and really for a nation that values mobility. It provides new opportunities for recruitment and for retention. It provides a very exciting opportunity for relocation. If you as an individual need to relocate to another state for personal reasons, the compact basically allows you to start work on day one, assuming that you're hired, and I hope you are. In the fire service, the concept of a lateral transfer, that was essentially unheard of 30 years ago when I was a firefighter. But now we understand because we are mobile, that's very important. And so this concept of lateral transfers, the compact allows you to immediately start using your EMS license on your first day of hire. It provides new opportunities for things like surge events, or filling in gaps. During the COVID time and during the flu season, sometimes we have EMS agencies that lose a significant amount of their workforce and they have an urgent need for staffing. The compact allows for that. And routine operations. It also allows for special events. Perhaps you've heard of something like, Burning Man or the Indianapolis 500 or NASCAR events or the Super Bowl. Well, the EMS Compact allows for agencies to actually bring in temporary personnel to help staff those events. Also, disaster response. And a real quick word on disaster response. Because the EMS Compact is active 24 hours a day, 7 days a week with no notice, the moment a disaster happens, EMS personnel can legally affiliate with a local agency and work with that agency. Now, there are other compacts that are specifically designed for disasters. For instance, EMAC. EMAC is something that would definitely kick in for any large-scale disaster, usually a few days after the event. It requires a governor or a presidential declaration. It requires certain paperwork and funding agreements. All of that is important, and it provides another mechanism. But the EMS Compact doesn't compete with EMAC, nor does it replace EMAC. It provides an alternative to EMAC for that initial response, which is very important. And then the final thing is for education and training. Maybe you are working in a small town. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to actually work in a large urban city? Well, under the EMS Compact, assuming that the agency hires you, that's a real possibility. And that's so important for developing your career and your education and your training. Or maybe you do work in that large city and you would love to know, hey, what's it like to be a paramedic out in the front range, out in the rural or the very frontier parts of our nation? Those opportunities are available to you as well. So what this does is for the individual clinician and for employers, it provides new mechanisms for us to actually combat things like workforce fatigue and burnout. Yes, it provides new career opportunities, but think about that urban EMT or paramedic that is in a high volume system and they're getting a little bit burned out. But what if every few months they were able to go and maybe they like to ski in the wintertime? Well, I can tell you, there's a lot of ski towns that need good EMTs and paramedics. So maybe they do a job swap for a few months to go work in that, ski town. Or maybe they want to experience what it's like to work by a beach or out in frontier America. The EMS Compact, it doesn't solve all these issues, but what it does is it provides new opportunities for both the employer and U.S. EMS clinician by removing the hassles of paperwork and bureaucracy so that these new opportunities, which are already being enjoyed by our nursing colleagues and our colleagues in other healthcare professions, it means that we too can utilize these techniques for recruitment, retention, and hopefully providing really exciting career opportunities for everyone in EMS. However, the EMS Compact actually goes beyond that mobility of personnel. Yes, that's a big part of the compact, and that was probably the core reason that states came together. But the EMS Compact legislation actually goes beyond that and creates a whole new government body. And this new government body requires states to collaborate on all issues related to EMS personnel and how these EMS personnel operate. It requires that collaboration so that states are no longer working in silos, but we're working together on issues. It also requires that these states share data, and specifically data about the EMS workforce and licensure data. And it requires that we have a unified approach to regulations. It does not take away state sovereignty, but what it does say is that, hey, let's come to the table as states, and before we develop a siloed approach, let's see if we can do something that advances the profession and solves a problem on a greater scale. So those are important parts of the EMS Compact that go beyond mobility. The EMS Compact ultimately increases access to EMS personnel, it increases public protection, and it advances the EMS profession in a whole new way. As I noted, the EMS Compact, in addition to mobility, has 7 parts of the law, and I have these up on the screen for you. And the EMS Compact increases public access to EMS personnel. It protects the public health and safety. It encourages cooperation. It supports the licensure of military members and their family members. It facilitates the exchange of information and data. It promotes compliance with the state laws governing EMS. And it provides states the authority to hold all EMS personnel accountable. And that's a very important part of being a profession. So next, we've covered the state law. Now let's talk about the coordinated database. So the EMS Compact includes within the law the creation of the National EMS Coordinated Database. Sometimes we call this NEMSCID. Now the National EMS Coordinated Database is powered by the National EMS ID number. The National EMS ID number is a 12-digit number, and this number does not change. During my EMS career, I've had probably 30 different license numbers, national registry numbers, etc. And they all change. Well, the National EMS ID number will never change. And you are issued one, and that one number is utilized by both the National Registry, it's used by CAPC for education, and it's used by all the states that are part of the compact, and hopefully one day soon by every state in the United States. And this 12-digit number allows states to link licensure data and education data and national registry data together. But it also provides a way for you or the public to actually search and do a credential validation. Now, unlike searching if I'm a paramedic in Louisiana or Colorado, you can actually use the National EMS ID number and see a complete record. Now, the screenshot is a little bit dated, but you're able to see that my 12-digit EMS ID number shows that I have a green outline, meaning that I have a privilege to practice. My compact privilege is valid. I have a state license issued by at least one compact state. On here, it's showing 2. You can also see my state license number, the level I'm licensed at, and any expiration date. You can also see my national registry information. Now, how do you validate this? Well, this information is available on the EMS Compact website, www.emscompact.gov. Well, that might raise the question. Well, how do I get a EMS ID number? Well, EMS ID numbers are issued to anyone who has ever in their life taken the National Registry exam. Or if you are current, you can log in to nremt.org and see your 12-digit number, or you can contact your state EMS office. Now, a few more things about the database. The database not only keeps track of all this information, but it deduplicates this. So before the EMS Compact, if you wanted to know, for instance, how many EMTs or paramedics are out there, one of the common approaches was for me to call Louisiana and call Colorado and say, how many paramedics do you have? Well, as you can see from just this example, I would be counted twice. And that's a problem. So the EMS Compact actually deduplicates this. So for the first time in the history of our profession, we can know how many individual people are licensed. And that's very important for things like national security, disaster response, and planning. It also helps us understand the workforce. Now, a few more things about the data. What if you put in your number and nothing comes up? Or what if you put in your number and the information's wrong? Who do you contact? Well, unfortunately, you don't contact the EMS Compact office because under the law, our office is not allowed to change, edit, or modify any of the data. Data integrity is very important. The EMS Compact shows what is given to us from the state licensure system. So if you have an issue with the data, either missing data or data that's not accurate, you need to call that state. So call your state EMS office, get in contact with them, tell them the issue that you're having. In very rare occasions, there might be an issue with the data moving between systems, but your state EMS office is the one that is prepared and legally authorized to address that. Okay, finally, the last thing that the EMS Compact Law creates is this Interstate Commission for EMS Personnel Practice. This is the governmental body that is charged with overseeing and coordinating the interstate practice of EMS. This governmental body has rulemaking authority, and it is comprised of governor-appointed commissioners. When a state passes the EMS Compact Law, the Compact Law says that the governor or the governor's designee will appoint a commissioner, and that commissioner is the individual in the executive branch of government that oversees the licensure of EMS personnel. In most states, that is what we would call the state EMS director. That is your state EMS office and whoever is part of the executive branch that is responsible for operating that office. That individual is then governor appointed and represents the interests of the state to the commission. The commission has the ability to make rules, has the ability to take votes. The commission is responsible for coordinating between states. Again, this is a governmental body. It's not a nonprofit organization. It's not an association. It's not, some other type of an organization. It's definitely not for profit. The organization is a governmental body, and this governmental body is, outside of states, the highest regulatory body for the interstate practice of EMS and the regulatory body for EMS personnel licensure in the United States. So we covered a whole lot of foundation, but you're probably asking, well, okay, thanks for the foundation, but how do I actually use the compact? How does this impact me as an EMS clinician, as an EMT or paramedic? So let's go through that. So as of right now, mid-2025, the EMS Compact has 25 states that are members. These states have passed the law and are part of the EMS Compact. And you can see those on the map in front of you. Our vision is that in the next few years, hopefully we can get all 50 states, if not very close to all 50. That's part of the EMS Compact. The EMS Compact, under the law, has some requirements for both the state and for the individual. Let me first review what's a requirement for the state. So the state has to, one, pass the replica law. The state has to require national registry from that point that they pass the law forward for the initial licensure at the EMT and paramedic level. The state is required to perform a fingerprint FBI compliant criminal history check. And this criminal history check allows the state to determine if you meet the requirements for licensure. The state has to have a complaint process, meaning they have to have a way of receiving and investigating complaints. And then finally, the state EMS office has to connect their licensure system with the National EMS Coordinated Database. The sharing of licensure information is absolutely essential for states to operate in a compact. Real briefly, I talked about the driver's license compact. Well, these requirements are very similar. In the driver's license compact, the reason states are comfortable recognizing a driver's license from another state is they have established the same baseline requirements for getting a license. They've established a process for the state to actually issue a secure license. They have a data system, and that data system allows for that license information to be standardized and shared amongst all states, so that if you happen to be driving too fast in another state and you're pulled over, the police officer that pulled you over can actually validate that your license is authentic, it's correct, and, well, if they issue you a citation, they have a way of actually reporting that back to your home state. The EMS Compact works very, very similar to that. Now, these are the requirements for the state. In addition to that, the EMS Compact operates on this concept of a home state, and a remote state. So a home state is, simply put, any state in the United States that's a member of the compact where you are licensed. So, for instance, as you already know, I'm licensed in the state of Colorado. Colorado is a member of the compact, and I'm licensed there. So that's my home state. I'm also licensed as a paramedic in Louisiana. Well, Louisiana is a member of the compact, and I'm licensed there. So guess what? Louisiana is also a home state. So under the EMS Compact, multiple home states are possible. Now, I'm also licensed as a paramedic in Ohio. Ohio is currently not part of the compact. So while I do have a license in Ohio, Ohio is not a home state. The other thing I wanted to clarify is that home state has nothing to do with your domicile or where you live. Home state, again, is where you are licensed. You have to have at least one home state that's part of the compact, but you can have multiple. Now, on the other hand, a remote state is any other member state of the compact. So as of today, the member states that are in blue, any other member state of the compact where I'm not licensed. So for instance, for me, I am not licensed in the state of Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania would be a remote state, as well as Texas and Oklahoma and Idaho. So again, a home state, the state that you're licensed in, that's part of the compact. A remote state is any other state. Now, it's also important to note that I can legally work in any of the 25 states. I can also legally work in Colorado or Louisiana. But it's important to note that because I'm licensed in that state, when I operate in a state that I'm licensed in, I'm operating under my state license, not the EMS Compact. So, there's a real advantage of only being licensed in one home state and then using a privilege to practice in the other states. There's no restriction. You can be licensed in as many as you want, but just know that you are no longer using the value of the EMS Compact when you get a license there. So the EMS Compact provides this concept of a privilege to practice. And the privilege to practice is essentially where that remote state recognizes your home state license and gives you a privilege to use that license in their state. And for most parts of state law, that privilege is equal to a state-issued license. There might be a few minor caveats to that could vary state to state. But in every common situation for EMS practice, if you are licensed in one home state, the other states agree to give you that privilege for everything covered under the terms of the compact. Now, let's get to the individual requirements. What do you, as an EMT, paramedic, advanced EMT, what do you need to know about utilizing your EMS compact privilege to practice? Well, number one is you have to be at least 18 years old. We recognize that some states license individuals under the age of 18. Well, that's a state decision. But if you are under the age of 18, you do not have a privilege to practice under the compact until you're at least 18 years old. Number two, I think I've already covered this quite a bit, but you have to have an unrestricted license from a compact member state. And that license has to be at the level of EMT, paramedic, or a level between EMT and paramedic. And that certainly includes levels such as advanced EMT. But maybe you are a little bit old school in EMS, and maybe you're an EMT intermediate, or maybe even an EMT cardiac tech, or another level between EMT and paramedic. Well, the good news is you are covered under the compact. We'll get to scope of practice a little bit later. Now, let's also go outside of that. Let's say that you are a first responder or an EMR. Or let's say that you are a pre-hospital RN or a respiratory therapist. That is not covered under the compact. So the compact covers EMT, paramedic, and anything between those two levels. The next thing is you have to be affiliated with an authorized EMS agency. This does not require that you are paid. You could be volunteer or paid, but you have to be affiliated. And so you have to be with an EMS agency that's authorized. And then finally, the compact requires that you have a physician EMS medical director. Now, some states may allow medical direction by, maybe an advanced practice nurse or a physician assistant. For the purpose of the compact, it has to be a physician EMS medical director. Again, these are the individual requirements. Now, I will note, and I get this question a lot, well, how about the National Registry? Well, the compact does require National Registry for the state to use for all initial certifications moving forward. And I would encourage you to have and maintain your National Registry. I've maintained mine over 30 years. It's a good thing to do from a profession. But the compact does not require that you maintain National Registry. We would encourage it, but you don't have to maintain it. Your compact privilege is linked to a valid state license in a compact state, and you have to meet the requirements of that state to have and to maintain your license in good standing. Now, I want to zoom in just a little bit on this affiliated with an authorized EMS agency. I get this question probably more than any other question out there. So the first part is, well, what's an EMS agency? Well, an EMS agency is best defined by the state EMS office and state law of the state that you want to work in. EMS agency definitions vary state to state. In some states, an EMS agency might have a pretty narrow definition, meaning an ambulance service or an ambulance service that responds to 911 calls or transports patients. A state has the sovereign authority to define that. In other states, EMS agencies might be much broader than that. And it might include, first response agencies. It might include even clinics or hospitals or non-traditional EMS entities that are authorized to hire EMTs and paramedics. So if you have a question about what an EMS agency is, contact your local state EMS office. The compact says you have to work for an authorized EMS agency as defined by the local state. So if I'm in Colorado, I have to work for an agency that the state has defined as an EMS agency, and then I'm good. And I can tell you in Colorado, it's pretty broad. Now, here's the other thing that's very important. The EMS agency that you are working for must be legally authorized to operate in that state or in that local jurisdiction. Now, maybe that sounds like common sense, but I get a lot of questions on this. And let me give a theoretical example. Let's say that I work for Donnie's Best EMS Ambulance Service in Colorado, and I'm working there and it's wonderful. And then I have an opportunity to go and respond to maybe a wildfire incident as a paramedic. And so I want to go with Donnie's ambulance service and as Donnie paramedic to this wildfire in another state. Well, maybe Donnie's Best Ambulance Service is not licensed in, say, Idaho or Wyoming or West Virginia. So that would create a problem. So while I individually am covered by the compact, I have to work for an agency that's also legally allowed to operate. And part of my professional responsibility as a professional medical clinician is to ensure that I'm working for an employer that is legally allowed to operate. Now, when an agency is not allowed to operate in another state, well, that's a question for the agency's legal advisors, and for the state EMS office to figure out. But just know that it's your professional responsibility to work for an agency that's legally authorized in that other state. Some states allow transport of patients between states for a few transports per year on the agency before that agency has to get licensed. Other states have different requirements. The bottom line is your agency has to be legal and legally allowed in that state, and you've got to work for an authorized agency. Now, I've mentioned a lot about agencies, but agencies are very, very important for the EMS Compact. In fact, the EMS Compact puts a lot of faith and trust and empowerment to that local EMS agency. It really is, in many ways, the backbone of the EMS Compact. It's the EMS agency that makes every employment decision. So while I have an EMS Compact privilege to practice in 25 states, I can't demand for Indianapolis EMS to hire me tomorrow just because I have a compact privilege. No. But if Indianapolis EMS wants to hire me and I am the right candidate for them for short-term, medium-term, long-term, or if they want me to help out with the Indianapolis 500, that's their decision. So employers are never forced to hire someone, but they now have access to over 400,000 EMS clinicians across the nation. The employer's job is to validate competency, just as any employer should. So yes, I'm a Colorado paramedic today. I'm not currently practicing in Colorado. I could go to a Colorado agency. They could choose to hire me. And if they choose to hire me, they should validate that I'm actually still competent. I can still start the IVs. I can still intubate. So the agency has that job, regardless if the individual comes from the compact or comes from being state licensed. It's your local EMS agency that really sets the scope of practice within the confines of state law. They're also responsible for medical and operational protocols. It's that local agency that provides your medical director. They also provide your medications and your supplies. If you're a paramedic, it's their DEA number through that medical director and through the agency agreement that those medications are purchased. They provide insurance and they make sure that they are operating within all state law. So the role of the EMS agency is vital for the EMS Compact and is incredibly strengthened through the compact. Let's talk about two operational examples, and let's apply this into real life. So Again, let's say that I'm a Colorado paramedic and I want to go and work in Idaho. So I, as an individual, want to go and work in Idaho. Both are compact states. I have a privilege to practice that's valid in Idaho. So how does this happen? Well, number one is I've got to find an agency that's legally authorized in Idaho to actually hire me and to put me on their roster. But once I do that, and I am individually affiliated for whatever period of time that is, I'm going to follow that local agency's protocols. I'm under that local agency medical direction, and I'm practicing under the scope of practice established by both the state of Idaho and that local EMS agency and the medical director. Now, what happens if there's a gap in my knowledge? Well, that gap in the knowledge should be identified by that local agency or their medical director, and then that gap has to be rectified. So I might have to do some additional local training, and it could be operational or medical in focus. I guarantee you, I will probably need to learn a little bit about the local ambulance, the local roads, the local hospital, the local traditions, the local culture, right? Those are some of the examples of things that's all handled at that local level. Now, let's also look at another example. And this other example is that I am working for a Texas ambulance service. Maybe it's a ground ambulance service. Maybe it's an air ambulance service. But I'm working for a Texas ambulance service, and I am transporting a patient from Texas. And let's say I'm taking a patient into Louisiana. Well, assuming that the agency is legally authorized to do that, then I, as an individual in the compact, will be covered. But I'm not going to just change my protocol the moment my ambulance drives into Louisiana. That makes no sense. I'm going to follow my home agency protocols, my home medical direction, my home scope of practice, and continue that patient care. So this highlights really the simplest way to understand the EMS Compact as it relates to scope of practice and protocols. You're going to follow the scope of practice and the protocols by the agency that you're affiliated with. Now, there's some legal language in the compact that defines this, and you can contact the compact office if you want to walk through that legal definition. But this is the simplest way to understand it. So whoever you work for, whatever agency you work for, assuming that they are legal to operate in that jurisdiction, you're going to follow those protocols, that medical direction, that scope of practice. It's important to note that the EMS Compact absolutely does not allow independent practice. I can't just put my own independent shingle up as a paramedic. Now, let me give some real life examples of this. Yes, I'm a paramedic, but, XYZ company, maybe they are a camp. Maybe they're a construction company. Maybe they're a casino, right? They can't hire me individually as Donnie Paramedic for my individual services. And the compact absolutely does not allow that. So make sure, again, you're with an authorized EMS agency. One more quick note about state licensure, and I get this question quite a bit. And that is, well, Donnie, how long can someone work under the compact privilege? Well, the EMS Compact law does not set a time limit on the privilege to practice. But I can tell you that as a professional, it's very important that you become part of your local system. And so while the compact doesn't say 1 day, 6 months, 1 year, what we do say is that we encourage you to obtain a license in whatever state you consider home. And by home, what state do you live in? Become part of that local EMS system. Get your state license there. That's part of being a good professional. Again, not required under the compact, but it's something that we encourage you to do. A little bit about state EMS offices. So the EMS Compact, again, as we've covered, goes beyond mobility. It encourages states to work together on things like regulations and requirements. But the EMS Compact also provides state EMS offices brand new tools for professional accountability. And as professionals, we all must come together and say that we value our profession and we are going to self-regulate. We're going to hold our own professionals accountable. We're going to hold our peers accountable. That's part of being a true bona fide profession. So the EMS Compact provides state EMS offices new authority to regulate and investigate EMS clinicians. EMS state offices have the ability to sanction any EMS clinician that's operating in their jurisdiction. So if I'm in the Colorado state office, I can hold anyone working in Colorado accountable. But I also have new ability for multi-state subpoenas. We know that EMS is highly mobile. Maybe you're part of a service that you operate between multiple states on a regular basis. Well, the EMS Compact provides the ability to conduct investigations with multiple states, for those states to share information, and for those states to actually issue subpoenas that cross state lines. So if I happen to be practicing in Kansas and there's a complaint that happens, the Kansas Office of EMS or the Colorado Office of EMS or the Texas Office of EMS can all collaborate on that investigation for the purpose of public protection and for identifying the truth. That's very important. And then finally, under the EMS Compact, anytime that there's discipline issued on a license, that is shared across the entire nation to all states. That's very important for both transparency and for public protection. Now, I will note that individual states retain their individual ability to make decisions on who's allowed to practice in that state. But under the EMS Compact, if I, for instance, with my Colorado license, am practicing in another state and discipline happens, my privilege to practice, note that it's called a privilege, my privilege to practice will be either canceled or suspended or limited until I resolve that legal complaint. And one revocation of my privilege means that my privilege in all states is revoked. My license in my home state will be intact, but my privilege is revoked. Multi-state operation is a privilege. It's a professional courtesy and a privilege extended through law. But it's for those providers who respect and maintain the highest standards of professionalism. A little bit about military. The EMS Compact extremely values our military partners and veterans and their spouses. We also recognize that part of military service requires frequent transitions between states. So the EMS Compact says that state EMS offices will expedite licensure applications for veterans, active duty personnel, and their spouses. Now, the EMS Compact has also said that the standards for licensure are the same. So everyone has to meet the same standards for licensure, but the compact and the state offices will expedite any processing if you want a license. But I will also tell you, as a reminder, if you're part of the military and you're licensed in one state, you have an immediate privilege to practice in all states as part of the compact, just like everyone else. One more quick note on the military and the licensure of personnel. In 2023, a federal law, part of the Service Members Relief Act, was passed, and this federal law addressed the mobility of military personnel and their spouses, and specifically related to licensure, not just EMS licensure, but all licensure. Licensure to be a teacher, licensure to be a physician, to be a dentist, to be a massage therapist, whatever the professional licensure required is, to be a plumber. And so this federal law, and you can access it through the QR code on the screen. This federal law basically says that if a member of the military and their spouse is relocated under military orders, whatever license they had issued is immediately recognized in their new jurisdiction, regardless of any other requirements. And I can tell you this has been tested and upheld in court, unless the state is a member of a compact. And if I rephrase that for our purposes, unless the state's part of the EMS Compact. And this is important for two reasons. One is the federal law recognizes that all compacts, professional licensure compacts, are truly the gold standard for portability. And the federal law says when states have worked together to identify a process, then we're going to respect that process. But if a state's not part of a compact, then this federal law is going to come into play and say that your state shall recognize that license. Again, this just underscores how important it is for states to be part of a compact that not only helps our military personnel transition, but also helps provide this in a mechanism agreed upon between individual states. As we conclude, I hope that you have found this to be an insightful and educational session related to the EMS Compact. As EMS clinicians, just like you have a state license, and just like you learned back in EMT or paramedic school, the importance of passing your exams, getting national certification, and then getting a state license. Well, today we have a new option in addition to state license, and that is the EMS Compact Privilege to Practice. If you're an EMS clinician, maybe you were surprised that you have the license, portability, and respect to operate currently in 25 states, and the number's growing. Maybe that helps you with identifying where you want to work or where you want to live. Maybe that relieves some of your anxiety. Maybe if you and your family are relocating, that will help keep you in the profession as opposed to you attritioning or transitioning out. If you're an employer, I hope that you are encouraged that now you truly have access to a workforce that is over 400,000 people, that if you're in an EMS compact state, they can start working for you tomorrow. Maybe it's for a surge event or a big concert. Maybe it's for staffing because your staff are sick with the flu. Maybe it's a new recruitment and retention drive. Maybe you want to, as an employer, try some new mechanisms. And maybe you want to partner with an employer in a different part of the country. Maybe if you're in an urban large city, you want to partner with someone in Frontier, Wyoming, or Colorado, or the mountains. Maybe you want to work with someone over on the coast with a beach or a shoreline to provide your clinicians the opportunities through mobility and through working through different systems so that when they return to you back to their home, that they have this new broad experience that makes them better employees and provides better services for your local community. If you have any questions about the EMS Compact, please go to www.emscompact.gov, or you can scan the QR code there. Our website contains a number of resource documents and podcasts and information. It includes the ability for you to validate your own privilege to practice. And it also includes the model EMS legislation, which I highly encourage every EMS clinician to at least be aware of and review. Have a great day. Thank you for what you do, and thank you for your service as an EMT, paramedic, or one of the levels between EMT and paramedic. Have a good day.